It was a cold, quiet night, the kind where the air feels thin and the world seems suspended in time. I had just gotten off a long shift at work and was driving back home, my eyelids heavy from exhaustion. The highway stretched on endlessly, and I began to drift, my mind half in a daze. My fuel gauge flickered, one of those annoying indicators that tells you it's almost too late to stop. I groaned and glanced at the clock. It was 2:30 in the morning. I wasn't exactly in the most populated area. The only lights on the road were from the passing cars, and the horizon was barely visible, swallowed up by darkness. A gas station appeared in the distance like a beacon. Its neon lights flickered on and off, barely hanging on. I pulled in, grateful for the chance to refuel and stretch my legs. The station was eerie, almost like it had been plucked from a forgotten time. The pumps were old, with yellowed plastic signs on the sides. The station itself looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. I stepped out of my car, pulling my jacket tightly around me to shield myself from the chill. As I approached the pump, I noticed something odd. There was no one in the small convenience store attached to the gas station. I wasn't sure if I expected someone to be there or if I was just too used to the convenience stores being open 24/7. The fluorescent lights inside flickered intermittently, casting a dull glow through the window. I decided to pay at the pump, not wanting to get too close to the store if I didn't have to. I slid my card into the pump and began filling my tank, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had started to creep up on me. The wind howled through the empty lot, making the night feel even colder, and the quiet seemed oppressive. There were no sounds of traffic, no signs of life anywhere. Just me and the gas station, alone in the dark. That's when I heard the door to the convenience store creak open behind me. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My first instinct was to turn around, but I didn't. I stayed still, trying to convince myself it was just someone else pulling in for a late-night stop. "Hey," a voice called out, raspy and unfamiliar. "Can you help me for a minute?" I slowly turned toward the sound of the voice, my heart pounding in my chest. Standing in the open door of the store was a man. He was tall, his face obscured by shadows, and he wore a faded red cap. He looked like he hadn't seen a razor in days, his beard a patchy mess. His clothes were torn, as if they'd been through some kind of struggle. I didn't know what made me hesitate longer, the odd, almost pleading tone of his voice, or the way his eyes seemed to avoid meeting mine. It was like he was looking through me. Something about him made me feel wrong. "I'm just trying to get some gas," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "What do you need help with?" The man took a slow step forward. His feet scraped against the pavement, the sound too loud in the dead silence of the night. "I've been stranded here for hours," he said, his voice cracking. "Can't get any help. The phones are down, and I can't seem to find anyone to get me out of here." I looked at the gas station, scanning for anyone else, but there was no sign of life. No cars, no employees. It was just me and him, and I felt like I was being sucked into something I didn't understand. "Do you need a ride?" I asked hesitantly, my mouth suddenly dry. He shook his head slowly. No, I just need some gas," he said, his voice soft, almost too soft. "You don't know how long I've been here. Please, just a little help. I'm really stuck." My instincts screamed at me to walk away, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me closer, the desperation in his voice too real. As I stepped closer to him, I noticed something strange. His eyes, dark, hollow, were locked on something behind me. They never blinked. They were fixed, like he was staring at something that only he could see. I turned around to see what he was looking at, but there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching into the distance, the lonely hum of the gas pumps. I should have known something was wrong then, but I didn't. I turned back toward the man. He was closer now, his face more visible in the dim light of the gas station. His skin was pale, too pale, like he hadn't seen the sun in years. And his smile sent a chill straight down my spine. It was wide, far too wide for a human mouth, stretching at the corners in a way that made my stomach twist. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice now low and guttural. "You shouldn't have stopped." My heart skipped a beat as the words sank in. It felt like I was suffocating, the air growing thick and heavy around me. I wanted to run, to get back in my car and drive away as fast as I could, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen. The man tilted his head at an unnatural angle, and I could see something dark in the corner of his mouth, something that wasn't right. He stepped closer, his breath now hot against my skin. "You're not going to leave," he said. And I swear I saw his eyes flash a pale blue, like the light of the moon reflecting off ice. Not until it's too late. It was then that I finally saw it. Behind him, in the store, was a figure. Another figure. This one was taller, its face obscured by the shadows, but I could tell that it wasn't human. It was something else. Something that had no business being in a place like this. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The man's grip tightened on my arm, his fingers cold and tight as iron. He pulled me toward the door of the convenience store, and I felt a sharp pull in my chest, like something was dragging me into the darkness. My mind raced, the fear now flooding every thought. I fought, trying to break free, but I couldn't. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare. Every attempt to escape making the terror worse. Then, just as I was sure I couldn't take another step, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine in the distance. A bright light flashed across the dark parking lot, and the man's grip loosened, his eyes darting toward the car. Without thinking, I wrenched my arm free and sprinted toward my car. The engine was still running, the headlights blinding in the distance. I didn't dare look back. I dove into my car, slammed the door shut, and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was no one there. The parking lot was empty. The gas station was silent, the lights flickering in the distance. I couldn't explain it. The man, the other figure, the overwhelming sense of dread that hung over the place. All I knew was that I had to get away. I threw the car in reverse and sped out of there, my eyes on the road, never once glancing back. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I don't know who or what I encountered that night, but I never stopped at that gas station again. I never told anyone the full story either, because I know what I saw, and I know that whatever it wasn't human.
Next story.
It was a long, quiet drive back home after a weekend getaway. The sun had already set and the sky was painted in hues of deep purple and blue. I had about 3 hours left before I'd be back in my own bed. The road stretched out before me like an endless ribbon, and I couldn't remember the last time I had seen a car in the rearview mirror. It felt peaceful, almost serene. But the peace didn't last long. I noticed the gas gauge was nearly on empty. My heart sank when I realized I hadn't seen a gas station in miles. There was a sign about 20 miles back, but it was now too far to turn around. My phone had no service, and the only thing I could rely on was my car's ability to make it to the next station. I started calculating the miles in my head, praying I wouldn't run out of gas in the middle of nowhere. Then, just as I was starting to panic, I saw it. Faint lights flickering in the distance. A gas station, or at least that's what I hoped it was. I drove closer, relieved but cautious. The place looked run down, like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The pumps were old, and the neon sign above the station flickered with an eerie glow. There was no one in sight, and no other cars were parked at the pumps. I pulled up to a pump, got out of my car, and walked up to the old pump. The metal surface was rusted, and the nozzle looked like it hadn't been used in years. I tried to ignore the creeping sense of dread that washed over me as I fumbled for my wallet. "Can I help you?" A voice called out from behind me. I spun around, startled. There, standing in the shadows near the entrance of the station, was a man. He was tall, wearing a dirty, faded uniform that had Bob embroidered on the front. His face was gaunt, with hollow eyes and a crooked grin that didn't quite seem to reach his eyes. Yeah, I just need to fill up," I said, my voice wavering a little as I struggled to keep my composure. "Sure thing," he said with an unsettling calmness, stepping closer. He moved slowly, almost deliberately. "You're lucky. This is the last station for miles." I nodded and started to pump the gas. There was something off about the way he was watching me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. His eyes never left me, and it felt like he was sizing me up, watching my every move. "How long has this place been open?" I asked, trying to make small talk, hoping to shake the uncomfortable tension. Bob chuckled softly, a low, raspy sound. "Oh, longer than you'd believe, but not many people stop by anymore." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just kept my eyes on the pump, willing it to go faster. The silence between us stretched out, thick and heavy. "You traveling far?" Bob asked, breaking the silence. Yeah, just driving home from a weekend trip. Got about 2 hours left. I tried to sound casual, but something in the way Bob was staring at me made me uneasy. His eyes narrowed slightly, and then almost imperceptibly, he smiled again. You're headed south, huh? Got a long way to go. I nodded, finally finishing up the gas. I had no idea why I hadn't left yet. Maybe it was the way Bob was standing there or the strange atmosphere that hung around the place. It was as though something was wrong, but I couldn't place it. All right, I said, attempting to brush off the weirdness. How much do I owe you? Bob didn't respond at first. He just stood there, his eyes lingering on me. It was like he was calculating something, weighing me in some way. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, he glanced at the pump. $25, he said simply, his voice almost too flat. I handed him the money, trying to ignore the chills crawling down my spine. As he took the bills from my hand, his grip tightened just slightly, almost as if he wasn't going to let go. My stomach twisted, and I felt a surge of panic. Thanks, I said quickly, yanking my hand back and stepping toward my car. Bob didn't say anything else, but his eyes followed me as I walked to the driver's side. I felt the weight of his gaze on my back, like something was pulling at me from the shadows. I got into the car and started the engine, ready to leave this strange place behind. But just as I was about to pull out, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. There, at the edge of the gas station, was a figure, a woman. She was standing just outside the flickering light of the station, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. My heart nearly stopped. The woman's face was pale, almost too pale, and her hair hung in tangled clumps around her face. She didn't move, didn't blink. She just stood there, watching me, her lips barely parted. I slammed the car into reverse, pulling away from the station in a rush. My eyes were locked on her, and I swear she hadn't moved an inch. As I turned the corner, I glanced into my rearview mirror and saw her still standing there, staring at me. I sped down the road, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling in my chest. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't ignore the fact that the gas station had been too quiet, too still. Like something was lurking in the shadows, just waiting to make its move. I couldn't stop looking back, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman following me, or worse, something worse. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me. As I drove further down the darkened highway, my phone suddenly buzzed. It was a text message. I pulled the phone from my pocket, barely able to read it in the low light. It was from a number I didn't recognize. You shouldn't have left. The price you pay is higher than you think. Your gas isn't the only thing that runs dry. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I pulled over to the side of the road, my mind racing. My pulse quickened as I stared at the message, not understanding what it meant, but knowing that something terrible was about to happen. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. The road was eerily silent, and in the distance, I could just make out the faint flicker of the gas station's lights. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a few shaky steps forward, barely able to breathe. Then I heard it. A whisper. A voice. Soft but unmistakable. You can't escape. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. But there was nothing there, just the empty highway stretching out before me. I got back in the car, locked the doors, and started driving again, my hands shaking on the wheel. The road seemed endless now, the miles stretching on forever. And though I kept glancing nervously in my rearview mirror, I saw nothing but darkness. The phone buzzed again. Another message. I almost didn't want to look, but I had to know. It was from the same number. You were never supposed to leave. The road is ours now. Welcome to the end. I could feel my pulse racing. That was it. I was too far from civilization, too far from anything that could help me. My body felt heavy, like the weight of the world had suddenly come crashing down on me. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn around, but I knew deep down that I couldn't. I didn't have a choice anymore. Then in the distance, I saw the flicker of lights again. The gas station. It wasn't a reflection. It was real. And this time, I knew there was no escape. I took one last look at my rearview mirror, and through the reflection, I saw something I couldn't explain. It was Bob's face, twisted and pale, grinning at me from the shadows. Before I could react, my phone went dead. My engine sputtered, and I knew in that moment the true horror had just begun.
Next story.
It was late, too late for anyone to be out on the road, but I had no choice. I was on a tight deadline, racing to get to a work event in another state. The hours had slipped by quicker than I expected, and now I found myself on a long stretch of highway, miles away from any sign of civilization. My gas tank was on empty, and there hadn't been a single car in sight for what felt like an eternity. When I finally spotted a gas station off in the distance, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It looked run down, but it was still open. The flickering lights of the sign were a beacon in the night, so I turned in, hoping they had gas and maybe even a snack or two to help me stay awake. I pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching beneath my tires as I stopped in front of the lone pump. The station was isolated, surrounded by a forest of trees, and there was a low, unsettling hum in the air. I could barely make out the faded letters on the building's sign, Joe's Gas and Grill, which seemed like an odd combination for a place in the middle of nowhere. As I stepped out of the car, I glanced around. There was a strange emptiness in the air, almost as if the place had been abandoned for years, even though the lights were on. I walked inside, the bell above the door jingling as I entered. The first thing I noticed was the smell, an overpowering mixture of grease and something sour like rotten food. The counter was empty, but there was a door behind it that led to what I assumed was the back area of the station. I didn't know what I expected, but when I saw the flickering light of the refrigerator case, I thought maybe they had something to eat, something to wake me up. I picked up a bottle of water and a pack of crackers, then waited at the counter. I wasn't the only one who had been drawn to the gas station. There was a man standing off to the side, just barely in the shadows, watching me with a blank, unsettling stare. I couldn't tell if he was a regular or if he was lost like me. Either way, he made me uneasy. He looked like he was from another time. Maybe the 80s, his clothes all outdated, his hair too long for this era, but it was his eyes that were the worst part. His gaze was fixed on me, unblinking, and when I caught sight of him, his lips twisted into a crooked smile. Need some help? The man's voice was raspy, like he hadn't spoken in years. I tried not to make eye contact for too long, but his eyes followed me as I walked to the counter. "I'm good, just getting some water and crackers," I said, trying to act casual. The man nodded slowly, but his eyes never left me. It was as if he was studying me, waiting for me to make the next move. I placed my items on the counter, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The cashier still hadn't appeared. Just as I was about to say something, the man spoke again, his voice lower this time, almost a whisper. "Don't get too comfortable." I froze. I didn't know what to say to that. He was still smiling, but the look in his eyes was unsettling, like he knew something I didn't, something bad. "Excuse me?" I asked, now feeling more confused than uneasy. But the man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned and started walking toward the door, his feet dragging on the floor as if he wasn't in a hurry at all. I watched him leave, trying to shake off the creeping feeling in my stomach. A few moments passed before the cashier finally appeared from the back. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with a tired look in her eyes. She walked up to the counter and gave me a small, polite smile. "Sorry about that. I had to take care of something in the back," she said. She rang up my items without much of a fuss. "No problem," I replied, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that was still settling in. "How long has this place been open?" The girl paused, looking up at me as if I had asked an odd question. "I'm not sure," she said, almost absently. "Long time, I think. Maybe longer than I've been working here." Her words sent a chill through me. It didn't make sense. How could she not know how long the place had been open? I decided to pay and leave quickly, but before I could take a step toward the door, I heard something strange. A low, guttural growl coming from behind me, from the back of the station. My heart skipped a beat. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. The back door was closed, and the building was as quiet as ever. The growl had sounded almost animalistic, like something was lurking just out of sight. The girl didn't seem to notice. She was humming softly, almost cheerfully, as she bagged my things. It was as if nothing strange had happened at all. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something seriously wrong about this place. "Is everything all right?" I asked cautiously. She paused, looking at me with a puzzled expression. "Yeah, why wouldn't it be?" I didn't know how to answer her. Something about the way she was acting, so casual, so normal, made everything feel even stranger. It was like she was in on a secret I wasn't allowed to know. I nodded, paid for my items, and quickly left the station. I was desperate to get back on the road, but as I stepped outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The man who had been in the station earlier was standing across the parking lot near the edge of the trees. He wasn't looking at me this time. His face was turned toward the woods, and he seemed to be waiting for something. His hands were shaking, like he was holding something back. I wanted to ignore him. I wanted to just get in my car and drive away, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood there, staring at the man, and in that moment, I saw something that I can't explain. A shadow moving behind him, something tall and unnatural, flickering in and out of the darkness. It was huge, towering over him, and it was closing in. The man's head snapped around as if he could sense my gaze, and his eyes met mine. But there was something wrong with them. His pupils were wide, almost as if they had no color at all, just a black void that seemed to suck in the light. He whispered something under his breath, too quiet for me to hear. But whatever it wasn't meant for me. I stumbled back toward my car, heart pounding. Without thinking, I started the engine and sped out of the lot, my eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. The station quickly faded from sight, but I couldn't shake the image of that man, his dark eyes, and the terrible thing lurking in the shadows behind him. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about that gas station. The strange empty air, the eerie hum, the things I couldn't quite explain. I told myself it was just my imagination, but every time I drove past that stretch of highway, I couldn't help but feel like something was waiting for me there. Something that would never let me leave.
Next story.
It had been a long drive and the night was growing late. My eyes were heavy with exhaustion as I pushed my car down the winding highway. I had been on the road for hours with no sign of civilization in sight. I was on a remote stretch of highway, the only sound being the hum of the tires against the asphalt. The trees that lined the road seemed to stretch on forever, their branches swaying ominously in the wind. The sun had long since set, and the darkness outside felt suffocating. The gas gauge was dipping dangerously low, and I knew I had to find a station soon. But there was nothing, just miles and miles of nothingness. As I checked my phone, hoping for a signal, the screen remained blank, showing no service. That's when I saw the flicker of lights up ahead. I squinted through the windshield, making out a small, isolated gas station on the side of the road. It was old, with a neon sign that flickered intermittently, casting an eerie glow in the darkness. A sigh of relief escaped my lips. Finally. I pulled into the lot, thankful to be out of the isolation of the empty road. There was only one pump. The place seemed deserted. The old gas station was surrounded by overgrown weeds, and the building itself looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The windows were grimy, and the lights inside were dim. But the pump was working, so I didn't think too much about it. I parked the car and got out, walking toward the pump. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a man standing at the entrance to the small convenience store, his back turned to me. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat that seemed too thick for the weather, and he didn't appear to be moving. "Excuse me?" I called out, feeling uneasy, but trying to brush it off as simple fatigue. The man didn't respond. I took another step toward the pump, my eyes flickering back toward the figure at the door. He still didn't move. I decided not to engage. Maybe he was just waiting for someone, or maybe he was just another traveler, but I wasn't in the mood for small talk. I started fueling my car, hoping to get back on the road quickly. The wind was picking up now, rustling the leaves around the lot. It was cold, and the air had an unnatural chill to it, as though something had shifted. I noticed that the man at the door had turned around. His face was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light. His eyes were dark, his gaze piercing and unsettling. He just stood there, watching me. I could feel a knot form in my stomach, but I forced myself to continue fueling. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of, but something about the situation felt off, like I was being watched. Suddenly, I heard the man speak, his voice low and gravelly. "You shouldn't stay here long." I froze, my hands still on the pump, and I turned to look at him. He hadn't moved an inch, but his eyes never left me. "What?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "This place is no good," he muttered, his gaze drifting briefly toward the ground. "People come here, but they don't leave." The words sent a chill through me, but I tried to laugh it off. It was probably just some eccentric local trying to warn me about some old ghost story or urban legend. I finished fueling, but the air around me felt thick, almost suffocating. "I'm just passing through," I said, taking a step back toward my car. The man didn't respond, but I could see his lips curl into a faint smile. It was an unsettling, almost predatory grin. "You should have kept driving." I wasn't sure what to say. A nervous laugh escaped my lips, but there was no denying that the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone in this place. I got back into my car, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. But as I began to pull out of the lot, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The man was standing there, just outside the convenience store, still watching me with that same unnerving smile. The road stretched out ahead of me, and for a moment, I thought everything would be fine. But then something strange happened. The gas station lights flickered, and as I passed them, I saw a figure standing in front of the pumps. Too tall, too thin. It was him again. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, speeding down the road. My heart was pounding, and I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see the figure chasing after me. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me. The rain began to fall heavily, turning the asphalt slick and dangerous. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was just some strange coincidence. But the image of that man standing motionless by the convenience store wouldn't leave my mind. I drove for what felt like hours, the road stretching endlessly in front of me. But then, just as I was about to cross into another town, I saw a sign, a small roadside diner with a glowing neon light. I needed to stop, to take a break from the driving. I pulled into the lot and parked, my hands shaking as I got out of the car. The diner was quiet, and the lights inside were warm and inviting. As I walked toward the door, I noticed a man sitting by the window, his back to me. He turned slowly as I entered, and my blood ran cold. It was the same man from the gas station. His dark eyes met mine, and that same unsettling grin spread across his face. But this time, he wasn't standing. He was sitting at a table, alone, with an empty cup in front of him. The diner's owner, a middle-aged woman, came over to greet me, and I tried to shake the dread in my chest. "Are you okay, hon?" she asked, looking at me with concern. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, trying to act normal, but my voice cracked. I kept my eyes on the man. "Who's that?" I asked, nodding toward the figure sitting by the window. She glanced in the direction I was looking, her face turning pale. "Oh, don't mind him. He's always here." I frowned, not understanding. "He's always here?" The woman nodded, but she didn't meet my gaze. "He's been coming in for years, but no one knows who he really is. He never says a word. He just sits there, waiting." I looked back at the man, but he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring out the window, his gaze far away. I didn't know what to make of it, but something inside me told me I had to leave, that something was wrong. I stood up abruptly, paid for my coffee, and rushed back to my car. As I started the engine, I glanced back one last time at the diner's window. He was gone. I didn't stop again until I reached home, but the image of the man stayed with me, his cold eyes and that grin, like a shadow that followed me. I've since heard rumors about that gas station, about the place that doesn't appear on maps, and about the strange figure that haunts the roadside. Some say he's a ghost, while others claim he's a warning. I don't know for sure, but I do know one thing. I'll never stop at that gas station again.
Next story.
I was on my way home from a business trip, driving late into the night. I had been on the road for hours, my eyes tired and my mind drifting, when I noticed the gas gauge was nearly empty. My stomach dropped. There was no way I was going to make it another 100 miles to the nearest town. The only solution was to stop at the next gas station, no matter how run down it looked. I spotted one on the side of the highway, just up ahead. The lights were dim, and there was no other car in sight, which struck me as odd. A gas station should always have someone pulling in or out, right? But I was too tired to think much about it. I just needed to get fuel, so I pulled into the lot. The station was older, a relic from another time. The pumps were outdated, and the small convenience store attached to the station seemed like it hadn't been renovated in decades. The flickering neon lights above the door cast an eerie glow across the parking lot, and the whole place had a sense of abandonment to it. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs as I looked around. The place felt wrong, like it had been left untouched for too long. There was something unsettling about the quiet, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. I approached the pump, and that's when I heard it. A voice, soft at first, like a whisper carried by the wind. "You need help?" I turned around sharply. There, standing just outside the convenience store, was a man. He was tall, thin, and dressed in an old uniform that looked out of place, almost like a costume. His skin was pale, too pale, and his eyes had a strange, lifeless quality to them. No thanks," I said, trying to sound casual as I went to start pumping the gas. "I'm good." The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching me with an unsettling calm. "You're sure?" he asked again, his voice eerily quiet. I nodded quickly, not wanting to engage further. As I pumped the gas, I tried to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. I had the distinct sense that I wasn't alone here, like something was lurking in the shadows. But I didn't want to seem paranoid. It was just a late-night stop, nothing more. But then, just as I finished filling up, the man spoke again. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. My heart raced in my chest, and I turned slowly, meeting his gaze. There was something in his eyes, something that made my blood run cold. I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly despite myself. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he just tilted his head as if studying me. "This station, it's been closed for years. No one stops here anymore." His voice dropped to a low whisper, "And they won't let you leave." I felt my pulse spike. I couldn't explain why, but the air felt thick, oppressive. I needed to leave, and fast. I took a step back toward my car, not daring to turn away from him completely. I had a bad feeling, like I had stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to know about. "I need to go," I said, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle. The man's expression changed. His lips twisted into a slow, unnatural grin. "You can't leave," he said. "It's already too late." My blood ran cold. I yanked open the car door, jumped inside, and slammed it shut. The engine roared to life, but before I could even pull out of the lot, the station's lights flickered and went out. Everything plunged into darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was happening? Just then, I saw something in the rearview mirror, something moving at the edge of the lot. The man was still standing there, but now there were others. Figures emerging from the shadows. They were all pale and gaunt, their eyes wide and unblinking. I could hear them whispering, their voices overlapping, becoming louder and louder. "You shouldn't have stopped. It's too late now. You're one of us." Panic surged through me as I slammed my foot on the gas, peeling out of the lot. My headlights illuminated the road ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The whispers grew louder in my mind, echoing in my ears. I sped down the highway, not daring to look back, thus not trusting my rearview mirror. The road seemed to stretch on forever, but every now and then I thought I saw shapes darting in the periphery of my vision, just at the edge of the headlights. Figures moving in the darkness. I don't know how long I drove. Time seemed to lose meaning. It was as if the world outside had changed, as if the road itself had twisted into something unrecognizable. But eventually, I saw a town ahead, just a few houses and a small diner, the first signs of life I had seen since the gas station. I pulled into the parking lot of the diner, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. I looked around frantically, expecting to see the figures from the station closing in on me, but there was nothing. I stumbled out of the car and into the diner. My breath ragged. The few people inside looked up as I entered, but they didn't say anything. The atmosphere was strangely quiet. Too quiet, as if everyone had been waiting for me. I approached the counter, and the old woman behind it gave me a long, hard look before she spoke. "You don't look so good, son." I swallowed. I just came from the gas station up the road." She didn't blink. "The gas station? You didn't come from there." I froze, my blood running cold. "What do you mean?" She leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing. "That place has been closed for years. No one stops there. Not anymore." I tried to explain. I had just been there. The man had been there, and she held up a hand, silencing me. You're not the first one. They all say the same thing. Who? I asked, my voice hoarse. The ones who stop at that station, they never leave. A chill ran down my spine. I turned to look out the diner window, my eyes searching the road. The gas station was there, just barely visible in the distance, its lights flickering. But now it looked different, darker, like it didn't belong in this world. Like I heard the woman's voice behind me again. They'll be back for you. I spun around, but there was no one there. I ran out of the diner and back to my car. I couldn't drive fast enough, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. The road felt endless now, the darkness wrapping around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the figures from the gas station were still out there, waiting. I don't remember how long I drove after that. All I know is that I eventually made it home, but safe and sound. But sometimes when I drive late at night, I still see the flickering lights of that gas station in my rearview mirror. And I know they're still out there, watching, waiting for the next lost soul to wander in.
Next story.
It was a night like any other when I found myself running low on fuel. I had been driving for hours on the highway, the familiar stretch of asphalt that led me home from a business meeting in the city. It had been a long day, and I was exhausted. My eyelids were heavy, and the steady hum of the engine was almost lulling me to sleep when I glanced at the fuel gauge. Damn it, I muttered. The needle was almost on empty. My mind raced. I'd passed a few signs saying gas stations were up ahead, but I hadn't seen one in a while. It was dark, the sky overcast, and the occasional misty drizzle made it hard to see far ahead. I kept my eyes peeled for a sign, and after what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A gas station logo glowing faintly in the distance. I didn't hesitate. The thought of running out of gas in the middle of nowhere made me anxious. I pressed down on the gas pedal and veered toward the exit, thankful for the relief that would come soon. When I arrived, I immediately noticed something off about the place. The gas station was small, no more than a few pumps, and the lights were dim, barely casting enough illumination to see. It looked outdated, like a relic from the past, and the sign was partially obscured by an overgrown tree. I pulled up to one of the pumps, the tires crunching over the gravel. There was no other car in sight. In fact, there was no one around at all. The station looked deserted. I got out of my car and walked up to the pump, noticing that the weathered sign next to it had a faded price for gas. Cheaper than what I was used to, but that didn't matter. I was just glad to have made it. The air was cold and damp, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I tugged at the nozzle to begin pumping. The station was unsettlingly quiet, except for the gentle drip of rain falling from the roof. As I stood there, I heard a low voice from behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. The voice was barely audible, just a whisper that seemed to slip through the night air. Slowly, I turned around. There, standing by the door to the small convenience store, was an old man. He looked out of place. His clothes were ragged, his skin pale, and his eyes sunken as if he hadn't seen daylight in years. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, and his posture was crooked, his eyes fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" I asked, trying to brush off the unease creeping up my spine. The man took a few slow steps toward me, his feet shuffling against the wet gravel. His breath was heavy, and his voice cracked as he spoke again. "You shouldn't be here, stranger. No one comes here anymore." I glanced around, feeling the hair on my arms rise. It was true. The place looked abandoned. But I was too tired to engage with him. I just needed to get my gas and leave. "Everything's fine," I said, trying to dismiss the strange feeling growing inside me. I turned back to the pump and continued fueling my car. "Look at the lights," the old man said, his voice low and tense. "They blink for a reason." I glanced at the lights above the pumps. They flickered, barely hanging on to life, their feeble glow making the entire place feel more desolate than it already did. I could feel my heart rate quicken as the old man's words replayed in my mind. Something was wrong. I should have just gotten in the car and left, but instead, I found myself speaking up. "Why's that?" I asked, my voice unsteady. He smiled, though it was a strange, hollow smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Because you don't leave once you've been here. No one does." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "What are you talking about?" I started to feel trapped, like I was the only one who didn't know the rules of this place. But before he could answer, a sudden noise interrupted us. the sound of a car engine revving in the distance. I turned instinctively, relief flooding through me as headlights appeared on the road, slowly approaching the station. For a moment, I felt like everything would be okay. Someone else would be here. But when I looked back toward the old man, he was gone. I stood frozen for a second, my heart thumping in my chest. I hadn't heard him leave. There was no way he could have moved that fast, and the convenience store door hadn't opened. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. Before I could make sense of what had just happened, the other car pulled up to the station. I glanced at it, expecting to see a fellow traveler who would either confirm my concerns or simply offer a sense of normalcy. But the car, a rusty sedan, was silent. No one got out. Curiosity overtook me, and I walked toward the car. The windows were rolled down slightly, just enough to let a cold breeze ruffle the air. But inside, the car was empty. My breath caught in my throat. There was no one in the car. I jumped back, startled, my mind racing. Where had the driver gone? How could someone park there and then just vanish? I turned back toward my car, now desperate to leave. The gas tank was full, and the last thing I wanted was to stick around any longer. As I reached for the door, I heard a loud creak, a sound like something heavy shifting, coming from the small convenience store. I hesitated. A shadow moved in the window, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone watching me from the inside. But when I looked directly at the window, no one was there. My heart was pounding now, every nerve on edge. Something wasn't right. I jumped into my car and slammed the door shut, turning the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, but as I began to reverse, I glanced back one last time. The old man was standing by the door of the store, his pale face peering out from the shadows, grinning. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I floored the accelerator and sped off, not looking back. The road stretched out ahead of me, a blur of darkness and mist, but my thoughts were racing. I wasn't sure what I had just experienced, but it felt real. Too real to be a figment of my imagination. By the time I reached the next town, my hands were shaking. I stopped at a diner to grab a coffee and try to calm myself. The diner was warm, and the soft hum of conversation from a few scattered customers helped ground me. I didn't mention the gas station to anyone, though. When I left, I took one last look behind me. The faintest glow from the station's lights was still visible in the distance, though they were fading into the night. The strange thing? When I searched for the location of that gas station online later, I couldn't find anything about it. No listing, no address, nothing. As if it never existed at all.
Next story.
I was just passing through, driving late at night on the desolate stretch of Route 66. You know how it is. Empty roads, the hum of your tires against asphalt, and the only light coming from your headlights cutting through the darkness. It had been hours since I last saw another car, and my gas gauge was running low. My stomach growled. I hadn't eaten anything in a while, and I figured I'd pull over at the next station to grab some food and fill up. I spotted a gas station in the distance, the flickering lights of the neon sign barely visible through the night. It seemed a little too quiet for such a late hour, but I was desperate. As I pulled into the lot, a sense of unease crept over me. The place looked ancient, the kind of station that hadn't seen much business in years. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find in one of those creepy horror movies where nothing is as it seems. There were two pumps, one on either side of the small, weathered building. I parked by the pump farthest from the door, just in case. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, like something was pressing down on me. The wind was still, and the only sound was the dull hum of the old lights above me. The station was isolated, surrounded by trees on all sides, and I could barely see anything beyond the dim glow of the lights. I got out of the car and made my way to the pump. It was quiet, too quiet. I thought about how strange it was that no one else was there, but I was more focused on getting inside to grab a snack and refuel. I tried to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. The door creaked open as I stepped inside, the bell above the door ringing faintly. The place smelled old, like dust and stale cigarettes. Behind the counter, there was an older man. He looked to be in his 60s, with a scruffy beard and a weathered face. His eyes, though, were what caught me off guard. They were wide, almost too wide, and fixed on me with an intensity that made me feel uncomfortable. "Need some gas?" he asked, his voice grating like sandpaper. Yeah, I replied, trying to sound casual, and maybe a snack if you have something. Sure, he said, not moving from behind the counter. Help yourself. I walked over to the shelves, eyeing the snacks. The place was stocked with outdated chips, candy bars, and sodas. There was a cold case, but it was dark, the fridge long out of service. I grabbed a bag of chips and a soda, making my way to the counter to pay. The man didn't say anything as I approached. His eyes never left me. Do you have any hot food? Like a sandwich or something? I asked, trying to make small talk. The man didn't blink. He just nodded slowly and pointed to the back of the store. Back there, I looked where he pointed. In the back corner, there was a small door that led to what I assumed was some kind of kitchen area, though it was hard to tell in the dim light. The door was slightly ajar, and I could just make out the shape of something or someone moving inside. Without thinking, I walked toward the door. The closer I got, the more I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something off about the way the door was slightly swaying, like it had been opened just a crack and someone was waiting for me to approach. I paused, then knocked lightly. The movement stopped. Complete silence. Then a low voice, rough and hoarse, responded, "We don't serve food here anymore." I stood there, staring at the door, unsure of what to do next. The old man behind the counter hadn't moved, still watching me with those unnervingly wide eyes. "Right," I said, turning back to the counter. I paid for the chips and soda, eager to get out of there, but something in me couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with this place. I headed back outside, the cool night air hitting me as I stepped onto the pavement. My car was still the only one in the lot. The old man's eyes were still locked on me as I walked to my car, and I could feel his gaze burn into my back. As I was about to open the door, I heard something. A voice, soft but distinct, coming from behind me. "Get in your car and leave. Don't come back." I froze. The voice was so close, like the man was right behind me, whispering in my ear. I spun around quickly, but there was no one there. I looked toward the door of the station, but the lights inside were flickering more intensely now, casting strange shadows. I didn't need any more convincing. I hopped into my car, started the engine, and threw it into reverse, backing out of the lot as quickly as I could. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, but when I glanced in the rearview mirror, the gas station was still there, standing alone in the dark. I drove for what felt like hours, the weight in my chest only growing heavier. The road was endless, but I couldn't escape the unease I felt from that gas station. And then, in the distance, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Another gas station. It wasn't long before I could see the flickering neon lights again. The same strange feeling washed over me as I realized this was the same station. How could that be? I had driven miles since I left. It didn't make sense, but there it was, the same old building, the same two pumps, the same man standing behind the counter, eyes locked on me as I slowed down. I slammed on the gas and sped past the station, heart racing. The whole time I could feel the eyes of the man on me, even though I didn't dare look back. I didn't stop again until I reached a town a few hours later, my hands shaking as I pulled into a well-lit, busy gas station. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, still on edge, but at least I was finally away from that place. The attendant at the new station gave me a strange look when I asked for directions, but I didn't care. I was just glad to be far away from the horrors of that cursed gas station. And then it happened again. As I walked back to my car, I glanced up and there it was, a neon sign in the distance. The same gas station, the same flickering lights. The man's face appeared behind me in the reflection of the window. I didn't stop to turn around this time. I didn't need to. I just got in my car, locked the doors, and drove away. I don't know how it happened or why it happened, but I've never been the same since. I avoid that road now, and I don't stop at gas stations after dark. I don't think I ever will.
Next story.
It was late, later than I would normally be out on the road, but the drive was necessary. I had just moved to a small town far from the city for work. The place had a quiet, almost eerie charm to it, but I was starting to get used to it. The one thing that unsettled me, though, was the stretch of highway between the town and the city. It was long, winding, and seemed to go on forever with nothing around for miles. I had been driving for over an hour, the headlights of my car cutting through the thick darkness. The road was empty, and the occasional signpost felt like a distant reminder that I was still on Earth, not some forgotten corner of a nightmare. I was already exhausted, my eyes growing heavy, and that's when I saw the gas station. It wasn't much, just a small, rundown place sitting by the side of the road. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and the building looked like it had seen better days. But at least it was open. The sign outside said 24 hours, and that was all I needed to see. My fuel gauge was on empty, and I was in no mood to keep driving with the possibility of running out. I pulled into the lot and parked near the nearest pump. There wasn't a single car in sight, and the place seemed eerily quiet. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like something is wrong. The gas station attendant's booth was empty, but the door to the convenience store was slightly ajar. I got out of my car, a sense of unease creeping over me. The wind had picked up, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, heading toward the pump. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. As I inserted the nozzle into my tank and began fueling, I heard the door to the store creak open. I turned my head, expecting to see the attendant, but what I saw made my heart race. A woman stood in the doorway. She looked ordinary enough, middle-aged with dark hair and a pale complexion, but there was something about her that made my skin crawl. Her clothes were simple, a faded green jacket and jeans, but her expression, it was vacant. She stared at me without blinking, her eyes hollow and distant. I tried to ignore her and focused on pumping my gas, but the woman didn't move. She just stood there, watching me. It felt as though she was waiting for something, like she wanted me to acknowledge her. Are you okay?" I called out, my voice unsteady. She didn't respond. She simply tilted her head ever so slightly, like a bird studying its prey. A chill ran through me, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe she was just tired or out of it. It was late, after all, but something didn't feel right. I couldn't explain it, but I had the overwhelming urge to leave. As I finished fueling, I turned toward my car. The woman's stare followed me, never breaking. I wanted to hurry up, but my legs felt like lead. My fingers fumbled as I grabbed the handle of my door, but just before I could get in, I heard her voice. "Don't go," she said, her voice low and raspy. I froze. My heart stopped. The woman took a step toward me. Her movements were unnaturally slow, deliberate. She reached out with one hand, her fingers curling in the air as if she was trying to catch the wind. "You have to stay. You have to stay here with us." My stomach churned. I didn't know what she meant by us, but it didn't matter. Every instinct I had screamed at me to get in the car and drive. Now. I yanked the door open and slid inside, my hands shaking. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts. But as I glanced up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The woman was standing at the window of my car, her face pressed against the glass. Her mouth was open, a dark, gaping hole where her lips should have been. She was smiling, but it wasn't a smile. It was something else, something I couldn't understand. I twisted the key in the ignition and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The tires screeched, and I sped away from the gas station, my eyes wide with terror. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I don't know how long I drove. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. Every turn, every stretch of road seemed to stretch on forever, and I had no idea where I was anymore. The landscape was unfamiliar, the dark trees closing in on me from both sides. Finally, I found a small town, a place I vaguely recognized from my earlier drive. I pulled into a nearby gas station, this one a newer, brighter building with a more welcoming atmosphere. I was shaking, my hands gripping the steering wheel as though it might slip away from me. The attendant behind the counter gave me a strange look as I entered the store, probably because I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I tried to act normal, grabbing a bottle of water, but my mind was still back at that gas station. The woman's face, her voice, the way she had looked at me. When I paid, I finally asked the attendant, "Hey, do you know anything about the gas station up the road, the one near the woods?" The attendant's face went pale. He looked at me for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. Then he leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You're not the first person to mention it," he said quietly. "That place has been abandoned for years, hasn't been open for a long time. People have been saying they see things out there. Strange things. People who stop don't come back the same. My stomach twisted as I heard the words. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more the pieces clicked into place. The woman, she wasn't real, or maybe she wasn't alive, and I had just narrowly escaped whatever had happened to the others who'd driven through that cursed place. I didn't tell the attendant anymore, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never drive that stretch of highway again. Whatever was at that gas station, whatever haunted that place, I wanted no part of it.
Next story.
I was driving home from a late business meeting when my car began sputtering on the highway. The last thing I needed was a breakdown, especially this far from any major city. I looked at the gas gauge and cursed under my breath. It was on empty, the needle hovering dangerously close to the red. I couldn't remember the last time I'd filled up. I had been so focused on getting to my meeting that I hadn't even noticed. I scanned the road, trying to spot any signs for a gas station, but all I saw were endless fields stretching out on both sides. The headlights barely cut through the thick fog rolling in. It was already past midnight, and I was starting to worry. Just as I was about to give up and look for a safe place to pull over, I spotted something in the distance, a small gas station, flickering lights barely visible through the mist. Relieved, I decided to stop. The place was small, nestled off the highway in a way that made it feel isolated from everything else. The parking lot was empty, which felt odd, but it was a small-town gas station. What else should I expect? I pulled up to one of the pumps and turned off the engine. There was no one around, but the lights above the pumps buzzed, casting a sickly glow across the gravel. I got out of the car and started walking toward the pump, but just as I reached for the nozzle, I heard the creak of the station door opening behind me. I turned, expecting to see an attendant, but what I saw instead made my blood run cold. A woman was standing in the doorway. She was tall, with dark hair and a loose-fitting long coat. Her skin was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her eyes were hidden under a hood. She didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me with an eerie calm. Her presence felt off, like she didn't belong in this world. "Can I help you?" I called out, trying to sound casual. It was a small town. Maybe she was just the owner or someone who worked here. She didn't move at first. Her eyes, however, never left me. Slowly, she stepped forward, walking toward me in a way that felt almost mechanical. My heartbeat quickened as I looked around. There was no one else here. It was just me and this strange woman. "You shouldn't have come here," she finally spoke, her voice soft but chilling. I raised an eyebrow, trying to keep my composure. "What do you mean? I just need some gas." Her lips twitched into a small, almost sad smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You won't leave." I laughed nervously. "Look, I'm just trying to get home. I'm low on gas. That's it." But she shook her head slowly, almost like she was pitying me. "It's too late." I stepped back, feeling an overwhelming urge to get back in my car. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'll just pay for the gas and leave." "That won't help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'll never leave this place." I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The fog had thickened, and the air around me felt oppressive. I glanced toward the car, my only hope for escape, but when I looked back toward her, she was closer, much closer than before. I stepped backward, then quickly turned and sprinted to my car. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door, throwing myself into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut behind me. I started the engine, but as soon as I put the car in reverse, something stopped me. The rearview mirror. There was someone standing in it. The woman was right behind the car, her face now fully visible. Her skin was so pale it almost seemed translucent, and her eyes were black, no whites at all. I hit the gas pedal, my tires screeching as I sped out of the parking lot, my heart racing in my chest. The woman disappeared from the mirror, but I could feel her presence, like a weight pressing on me from the back seat. The fog was so thick now I could barely see the road, the lines and signs becoming little more than vague shapes in the distance. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself that it was all in my head, but the strange feeling remained, gnawing at the pit of my stomach. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, but the road seemed endless. I couldn't tell how much time had passed, 5 minutes, 15. It was all the same in that fog, with no other cars, no sign of life. The feeling of being followed never left. Every time I checked the rearview mirror, I saw nothing. Yet I knew she was there, just out of sight. I felt her eyes on me, like she was watching every move I made. It was suffocating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw lights in the distance. A small town, an actual town, at last. My relief was overwhelming. I couldn't get there fast enough. But as I pulled into the town, I glanced in my rearview mirror one last time. The gas station was gone. The woman was gone. The fog began to clear as I drove through the town's main street, the streetlights flickering above. I pulled over into a gas station that looked open, but something felt off. As I got out to fill up, I glanced up at the building next to me, a diner with a neon open sign. A figure sat at the counter, its face turned toward the window. It was a woman, the same woman. Her face was pale, her eyes black, and as I caught her gaze, she smiled, that same chilling, knowing smile. I ran back to my car and drove away as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I got home, but I knew something had changed. I didn't feel safe anymore. Even now, sometimes when I drive through fog or late at night, I swear I can feel her presence, waiting, watching. I haven't gone near that road again, but deep down, I know it's only a matter of time before she finds me again.
Next story.
It was a long drive. I had just moved into a new town and I was looking for a change, something to leave my past behind. The roads were empty, almost unnaturally so, stretching on for miles, surrounded by dense trees and the occasional flicker of a passing streetlight. The only sound was the hum of my car's engine and the steady beat of the tires against the asphalt. The gaslight flickered on. Of course, I wasn't far from the next exit, but it was so late, well after midnight, and the gas stations would probably be closed by now. I had driven through this area before, and I knew there was a small 24-hour gas station not too far up ahead, so I pushed the thought out of my mind and kept going. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the flickering lights of the station in the distance. It was almost like a mirage, the neon sign lighting up the otherwise desolate stretch of road. It was the only sign of life in miles. I pulled in, not expecting much. The place had an old-school vibe, with a small convenience store attached and a few rusted gas pumps. It looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The building faded and weathered. I parked my car, threw it in park, and stepped out. A cold breeze swept through the lot, causing me to shiver slightly. The fluorescent lights inside the store buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the parking lot. But when I walked up to the door, I noticed something odd. The place was locked. Not a soul in sight. I glanced around. The highway seemed to stretch endlessly. No cars in sight. Just me. I checked my watch. It was almost 2 a.m. I knocked softly on the glass door just to make sure. Nothing. No sound from inside. I turned to leave, annoyed, but then I noticed something. A small handwritten note taped to the door. Gas pumps are open. Pay at the window. I blinked. I hadn't seen a window, but sure enough, as I walked around the corner of the building, there was a small half-open window in the wall. The window itself was old and dusty, with a thin metal grate covering it, but there was no sign of any attendant. Just a small wooden counter. I hesitated for a moment. Who would operate a gas station this late with no one around? Maybe it was an automated system. Still, it felt strange. I walked up to the counter, leaned in, and placed my debit card through the small opening. That's when I saw him. A man. He was standing in the corner of the small room, staring at me. He was pale, too pale, with dark circles under his eyes, his clothes ragged and stained. But what struck me the most was the way he stood, perfectly still, like he wasn't even breathing. His gaze was fixed on me, and I felt an icy chill run down my spine. There was something wrong about him, something off. I cleared my throat awkwardly, half trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. I just need some gas, please." The man didn't move. He just stared, his eyes unblinking. For a moment, I thought maybe he couldn't hear me, or he didn't understand. But then, without a word, he slowly stepped toward the window, his movement unnaturally stiff, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. He reached for my card and placed it on the counter without saying a word. Then, as if to signal that I could leave, he gestured toward the gas pumps. I took a step back, my heart pounding. What the hell was going on? I didn't want to stick around any longer than I had to, but I also needed the gas. I forced myself to walk back to my car. As I reached the pump, I noticed something strange. The other pumps, the ones across from mine, were already active, The numbers were ticking away as though they were in use, but there was no one around. I shook my head, dismissing the strange thoughts. Maybe the pumps were automated, and the man inside was just a weird night shift worker. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I pumped my gas quickly, my eyes darting back to the store every few seconds. Then I heard it. A sound like a tapping, almost like nails scratching against glass. I froze. The noise was coming from the window of the convenience store. I looked over, my breath catching in my throat. There, pressed against the glass, was the man. His face was distorted against the window, his eyes wide and unblinking. He had a twisted, unnatural grin on his face now, one that stretched impossibly far across his face, his mouth too wide. And then, without warning, he pressed his hand to the window. I wanted to scream, but the words got stuck in my throat. I couldn't look away, though I knew I should. Something in the air had shifted, and I suddenly felt suffocated by the eerie silence. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the man was gone, just vanished. I rushed to finish pumping the gas, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I twisted the nozzle back into place. As soon as I was done, I didn't even bother to lock the door. I got in my car, slammed the door shut, and drove away faster than I'd ever driven before. My mind was spinning. What had just happened? What was that man? I couldn't stop thinking about his eyes, that twisted grin, and the way he moved, unnaturally. It didn't make any sense. As I drove, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The gas station was still there. The lights flickered, but there was something more. In the reflection, I saw the man again, standing in the shadows of the store, watching me. I never went back. I don't even know if that gas station is still there, or if anyone else has ever seen what I saw. But I know one thing. There are things in this world that don't belong. And I think maybe that gas station wasn't just a place, it was a trap.
Next story.
I was traveling alone, heading back to the city after a long week of visiting family. The drive had been uneventful, save for the fatigue that set in as the hours wore on. The road I was on seemed to stretch endlessly, the miles slipping by in a blur until I noticed something that made me slow down. A gas station, nestled on the side of the road. It was late, almost 2 a.m., and I was desperate to stop. The gas gauge had been flirting with empty for the last 15 miles, and I couldn't afford to push it any longer. The place looked old, run down even. The kind of gas station that hasn't seen an update in decades. The lights above the pumps flickered, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. I wasn't thrilled about stopping at such a desolate place, but I had no choice. I pulled in, parked my car by the pump, and stepped out. The wind was chilly, and the smell of gasoline hung heavy in the air. The convenience store was closed, or at least it appeared to be. The lights inside were off, but the door was slightly ajar, just enough to suggest someone might be inside. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or nervous, but I knew I needed gas. I approached the pump, inserted my card, and began filling up. The hissing sound of gas pouring into my tank was the only noise in the air, and I tried to ignore the growing feeling of being watched. Then I heard it. A low, guttural voice, barely a whisper, coming from behind me. "Hey, you." I froze, heart pounding. I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. Standing there in the dark was a man. He was tall but thin, too thin. His face was pale, gaunt even, and his eyes were sunken deep into his skull, as though he'd been awake for days. His clothes were ragged, old, but I didn't see any dirt or grime, like they'd been worn by someone who hadn't aged in years. He wasn't looking at me, but rather at my car, his expression unreadable. "You need to leave," he said again, his voice harsh and crackling, like it hadn't been used in a long time. "This place isn't safe." I blinked, not sure how to respond. Was he a worker at the station? Or was he just some guy who had wandered out here at an ungodly hour? I just need to finish up here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man took a slow step toward me. "No," he said, shaking his head slightly. "You don't understand. You need to leave before it gets you." I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I felt a cold sweat trickling down my spine. Something wasn't right. There was no sense of urgency in his voice, no pleading, just a strange calmness, as though he had seen this all before. I took a step back, glancing over my shoulder at the dark expanse of the highway behind me. It was empty, silent, not a single car in sight. The only light came from the dimly flickering lamps above the pumps. I didn't know what to do, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. I'll be going now, I said, my voice shaky. I started backing away towards my car, but the man's voice stopped me. You can't leave. His words were like a cold slap to the face, and for a split second I couldn't breathe. I froze, my legs suddenly heavy, my heart hammering in my chest. Listen to me, the man continued, his tone lowering. This place, it's not what it seems. It feeds on people like you. I wanted to run, but my feet were stuck in place, frozen by a sense of dread. I glanced down at the gas pump, the red numbers ticking away, the sound of gasoline still hissing into my tank. I finally managed to force myself to look away from the man, my eyes darting to the convenience store. There was something wrong with it too. The door that had once been ajar was now wide open, but no one was inside. Instead, I saw something moving in the shadows, too quick, too fleeting to fully make out. A shape slithering in the darkness. I gasped, my breath catching. What the hell is that? The man didn't answer. He took a step toward me, his movements slow, deliberate, as though each step took an effort. You have to leave, he whispered, before it finds you. I felt something shift in the air. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath in front of me. The flickering light above the pump dimmed, and then went out completely, plunging the area into almost total darkness. The only source of light now was the small, distant glow from the highway. I had to go. Now. With every ounce of strength I had, I turned and sprinted back to my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I jumped in, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. The car roared to life, and I didn't even bother to look back as I threw it into reverse and tore out of the gas station. I drove as fast as I could, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't know what I had seen or what that man had been trying to tell me, but the moment I pulled away from that gas station, it was like the weight on my chest finally lifted. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it. The gas station. Still there. Its lights flickering back on as though nothing had ever happened, and standing there in the doorway of the convenience store was the man. His eyes were locked on mine, unblinking. He didn't move, just stood there, watching me drive away. I never saw him again, and I never stopped at a gas station on that highway again either. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something was following me that night. Something I couldn't see, but knew was there.
Next story.
I had always been a bit of a skeptic when it came to ghost stories. Sure, I had heard the legends, the tales from friends and family about eerie encounters or strange happenings, but I never truly believed in them. That is, until one night when I found myself on a lonely stretch of highway with a gas station that I had no intention of stopping at, but did anyway. I had been driving for hours, trying to make it back home after a long trip. The night was pitch black, and the only thing keeping me awake was the hum of the tires on the asphalt. It had been a long day, and all I wanted was a quick stop to fill up my tank and get back on the road. I had passed a few small towns, but there was no sign of any decent place to stop until I saw it. The gas station. It wasn't much to look at. The neon lights were dim, barely casting any glow in the surrounding darkness. The pumps were old, rusted in places, and the building itself looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades. It sat by the side of the road, isolated from the world around it, surrounded by trees and endless stretches of empty highway. But I was tired, and my gas gauge was on empty. So, despite the unsettling vibe of the place, I decided to stop. I pulled up to one of the pumps and got out of the car, my eyes scanning the area as I walked toward the pump. The wind had picked up, and I could hear the creaking of the nearby trees, the sound carrying across the empty lot. There was no one around, no other cars, no lights in the windows, just the dull, flickering neon sign overhead. I inserted the nozzle into my car, and as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was strange. There was nothing to explain it, but something about the air felt thick, charged with an unspoken presence. I glanced over at the convenience store next to the pumps. The door was cracked open slightly, but no one seemed to be inside. I found myself staring at it for a little longer than I should have, my curiosity piqued. It was then that I heard it, a faint, distant sound like soft footsteps on gravel. At first, I brushed it off. It was probably just the wind or perhaps an animal moving nearby. But the steps grew louder, closer. And that's when I saw him, a man standing at the edge of the parking lot. He wasn't walking toward me, but his gaze was fixed on me. He was tall, wearing a long, dark coat that seemed to swallow him whole in the dim light. His face was shadowed, but I could feel his eyes on me, boring into me from across the lot. His presence was unnerving, like something was wrong. Something wasn't right about him. I tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the gas pump, pretending to mind my own business. But the man didn't move. He just stood there, staring. The sound of footsteps continued to get closer until I could hear them clearly now. Slow, deliberate steps. I glanced up again, but the man was gone, disappeared, as though he had never been there in the first place. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I was imagining things. My eyes were probably playing tricks on me. But just as I turned to look back at the convenience store, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door was no longer slightly ajar, it was wide open. And standing in the doorway was the man. He wasn't just standing there, his arms were stretched out, palms open, like he was inviting me to come inside. The emptiness of the place, the silence, made it all the more eerie. I felt my heart start to race, and for the first time, I had a real, undeniable sense of danger. I yanked the nozzle out of the tank, slammed it back into place, and rushed to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't even look back. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. The car roared to life, and I sped off, desperate to put that place behind me. I didn't dare look in my rearview mirror. I was too scared to see if the man was still there, still watching me. I drove for what felt like hours, the weight of the encounter pressing on me the entire time. When I finally pulled off the highway to take a breath and gather myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Something I couldn't see, but knew was there. I didn't know if it was the man I had seen or something else. But the strange, unsettling energy lingered long after I had left the gas station behind. A week later, I had to make the same trip again. I didn't want to, but work called, and I had no choice. This time, I made sure to take a different route, bypassing that stretch of highway completely. But as I passed a familiar junction, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A sign, barely visible through the trees, with the same faded letters I had seen before, 24-hour gas station. I drove right past it without hesitation. I would never stop there again. I don't know what I encountered that night, whether it was a ghost, some kind of strange trick of the mind, or something far worse. But I do know one thing. There's something about certain places, certain stretches of road that just don't feel right. And sometimes the best thing you can do is keep driving and never look back.